Awesome. Well, thank you all for turning out on this really beautiful night. It's really a pleasure to be here and to have such a large group to talk to. So, can you hear me? Not too well? How's that? Better? Okay. I don't know if this is turned on. We might want to make a little adjustment. It might be off. Just needs to move. We'll move it. And turn it up. Cool. How's that? Whoa. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, I'll make sure I talk loud. Is that good? All right. So my role over the past 6 years has been to study the ecology of tick-borne diseases in the Adirondacks, and this was kind of a new thing for me. My training is actually in biomedical science, and I used to be a professor at the medical school in Rochester, the University of Rochester, and there I studied tick-borne diseases, but I studied the cell biology of tick-borne diseases in the laboratory. About 20 years ago, my husband and I moved here to the Adirondacks, and I began teaching at Paul Smith's. And I was approached by some scientists at Trudeau Institute that they needed someone to do the field work with the big increase, the emergence of Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases here in the Adirondacks. And I said, well, I think you found your person, because I have a background in tick-borne disease, and I didn't want to be in the lab anymore. I wanted to be out in the field. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ecology and what that means. So why did we feel it was important to focus on the North Country? I'm preaching to the choir here. You all absolutely know that there is an issue, probably better than I do. You live it more than I do, living here in Essex County and living along Lake Champlain, where ticks have been here for a little while, but I live in the High Peaks region, and it's very new there, but it's very rapidly changing. So we consider the North Country an emergent area of infection with tick-borne diseases. And that's important for many reasons. People aren't prepared. Physicians aren't looking to diagnose tick-borne diseases. Many of you are aware of that. We also host a lot of visitors and residents that come to the Adirondacks, sometimes seeking solace. Oh, I come here to hike because there are no ticks here. And we really need to change that culture. People here in the North Country spend a lot of time recreating. So we feel it's our duty, the health department, and we're helping out with that. We're enhancing their efforts to inform visitors, residents, and their healthcare providers about the risk of tick-borne disease here. It's not just Lyme disease. How many of you know that there are other diseases that ticks carry besides Lyme? So most of you do know. Anybody know a name of one? Oh, the diseases that the ticks that you see. Anaplasmosis. Powassan. Okay, so yes, we're going to talk about those. So it's also true now, and this is pretty recent, that those other diseases are becoming evident both in the field, in the ticks that I collect in the field, and also they're seeing that in the clinic. So we're kind of trying to put two and two together here. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. And Paul Smith's, where I teach, is located in a really nice spot. We're kind of north there where the star is. That's a very difficult place for the folks at the Department of Health in Albany who are charged with monitoring the state. It's hard for them to get there. And Franklin County, Essex County, and Hamilton County are really a bit underserved by the health department because of our year-round population in these counties, and they don't have the staff, absolutely don't have the staff to do the field work. So at Paul Smith's, my students and interns and I have stepped up to fill in that gap. And we've been working collaboratively with the New York State Department of Health in Albany for, this will be year 6 for us. So when you think of Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases, you think of the little ticks. You all know those, right? I'm going to challenge that a little bit, and this just turned up, that's good. And maybe try to convince you that it's really not the tick's fault at all, right? Did you all know that ticks are born free of disease? Did you know that? They are. And where do they get the tick-borne diseases that they carry and give to us? From small mammals. So we can think of, there's so much to think about, and that's what intrigues me about this. There's just so much to think about. So we think of tick-borne disease, often Lyme. You get sometimes the bullseye rash. It's caused by that bacteria that's got a funny spiral shape, and some people say is like syphilis, but kind of not. But we really have to focus on these small mammals. Those are the reservoir for the various tick-borne diseases. The tick gets that upon its first feeding on a small mammal. So you really could say that it's the small mammal's fault, not the tick's fault. But they're much cuter than the tick, so we blame the tick. But I think it's important to understand that this really is the disease is out there in the landscape in animals. We often think of deer. We often call the ticks that carry Lyme deer ticks, and we're trying to change that a little bit. The deer are important for the adult ticks to feed, but they really aren't important in transmitting and keeping Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases out there in the landscape. They're considered dead-end hosts, so you often will find ticks in areas where there are lots of deer, but they don't really play a role in transmission of the disease from tick to tick and animal to animal. Birds, however, do. And it's sort of my impression I've been watching the emergence of ticks and their diseases for 6 years, that it is birds that are probably carrying and distributing ticks into new areas, like in the higher elevations in the North Country. And I'll show you a little bit why I think that might be. Birds can give ticks the infections. They can do that. So birds probably play an important role. So there's a lot to think about. Many people ask, why are tick-borne diseases on the rise? And most experts agree there are a lot of factors, but the limiting factor is climate. So especially in the Adirondacks, climate change, warmer and wetter, is likely the driving force for the northward expansion of ticks into our region. In other areas, it probably doesn't matter quite as much, but it's the limiting factor, and I'll explain why that is. So yes, we do feel that climate change is driving the spread of ticks. And in fact, the EPA considers incidence of Lyme disease to be a climate change indicator. So if we're almost warm enough to host populations of ticks, a tiny, tiny increase or change in climate causes a bit of an explosion in tick populations. So the behavior of ticks, most of you probably know, we encounter them when they do something called questing. So they get up on leaf litter or blades of grass and they look for hosts, but they only do this a couple of times a year. They feed 3 times. So they climb up and they're looking for animals to walk by. And that's when we encounter them, right? They climb up on the foliage and they put out their arms. They're arachnids. They have spider silk. So when an animal walks by, they cling on, and that's how you get bitten by a tick. That's how they find their animal host to feed on. But they spend the vast majority of their time, probably 90% of their lives, they live in a state of dormancy down in the leaf litter in the forest where it's really humid. They're subject to cold temperatures, so if there's extended periods of very cold, they can't survive. I'll show you a little diagram of the life cycle. They have a 2-year life cycle, so they do have to overwinter. And probably what limited their survival is the fact that it was too cold here for them to overwinter. But now they seem to be able to at higher and higher elevations and further north. So it's also good to remember that if they can't find that nice humid duff layer, leaf litter, grass, they probably won't survive drying out. That's ticks' big challenge is desiccation, drying out. So the warmer weather we're having with climate change is also enhancing their ability to survive. So that's probably the cause for the expansion and the increase in numbers. And it really is dramatic. What I've seen over the past 5 years is really astounding. We really had to push hard to find ticks anywhere except along Lake Champlain, where you all live. But in the other areas of the Adirondacks, the higher elevations, we really didn't see any ticks, and now they're quite abundant. So 5 years has caused an enormous change. So this is just to remind you, most of you know that the scientific name of this black-legged tick, the deer tick, I mentioned that we're trying to get away from calling them deer ticks, because if you get bitten by a tick and you call your doctor, well, what kind of tick was it? Does it have black legs? That's kind of a marker of the type that carry these diseases, and it's going to be the one you're going to encounter probably 99% of the time in this region. So we'd like to call them black-legged ticks because they have black legs, and that helps. So they do have 3 life stages. They are larval form, and those are really harmless, thank goodness, because last year there seemed to be a big larval season last summer, and I was getting some calls from people who were picking hundreds of larval ticks off their kids in their yards, and they were so afraid. But luckily, as far as we know, the larval ticks haven't fed yet, so they don't carry disease yet. Then the nymphs are sort of the immature stage, and they're the size of poppy seeds. This is probably prime nymph season right now, just so you know. They're really tiny, hard to see, poppy seed size, but I'll show you in a minute. That's the time, this time of year, and the bite of a nymph is where the vast majority of people become sick with tick-borne diseases. Not quite sure why that is. And then there are adults that you might find in the pretty much year-round. The peak activity of the adults is in the fall. So ironically, just when you put away your bug repellent thinking it's Columbus Day, summer's over, that's the time to encounter the adult ticks. And again, talking to you all, you've probably encountered many more than I do in my home turf. And I'm usually talking to people where ticks are new, so you all can probably give me some pointers about where they are and what their behavior is. Every time I look at this, I get confused, but I think it's important to understand that ticks do have a 2-year life cycle, and it is important to know the seasons where you're at greatest risk. So like I mentioned before, right now we are in the nymph season. It's late spring. But prior to that, eggs were laid by adults that fed last fall. They hatched in the spring, or they will hatch in the summer. So it's kind of confusing. They're overlapping seasons here. So larvae tend to hatch in August. And so it's pretty harmless. So high summer is a time when your risk of tick-borne disease is probably the least, August and September. So the nymphs are active now. The adults, you find them pretty much year-round as long as the temperature is above 40 degrees. Even with snow cover, the ticks will be active. They're always hungry. The adults will be. The nymph season is shorter, and in this area, it's probably mid to late May to early July, and it's a little more abbreviated. I find this easier to look at. So what we're showing here is the months of the year from January to December, and it also shows kind of the relative numbers of ticks you might encounter. So in the winter months, you might see some adults in red. They carry disease, yes. In springtime, late May, June into July, in green, you'll see the nymphs, and those are the dangerous ones. Notice in August and September, the blue, lots and lots of larvae, but as far as we know, they're harmless, don't carry disease. And then in the fall, the adults are going to be out questing. So this is the time when these different life stages of ticks are up, looking to get on a host, and can get on you and your pets. I'm just going to go ahead and click that. This is a graph some of my students put together showing the time of the year that most reports of Lyme disease, which is the most common tick-borne disease, appear. So here's January through December, and notice the vast majority of human cases are reported in these summer months, in June and July, right where we are right now. And it kind of surprises me that it seems as though either not as many people get bitten by adult ticks in the fall or in the spring, or perhaps they remove them quicker, or perhaps the biology of transmission is a little bit different. But the nymphs seem to be the cause of most human infection, for whatever reason. So I just want to show you quickly, or convince you, that the incidence of tick-borne disease really is on the rise in the North Country. And I'm going to show you some statistics that Susan and I were talking about earlier today. This is what she tracks, and she actually is involved in collecting this data from area healthcare providers. And my students sort of looked at it and put it into graphs that show the change. So we're going to look at Lyme disease, which is the biggie, but also these other diseases, which you all knew about: babesiosis, anaplasmosis, and Powassan. So what the students did here, we looked at the incidence, actually this is the number of cases of Lyme disease in New York. And the blue line shows statewide, all through the state, and we're looking at it from 2006 all the way up till the most recent data that's posted and available to us, 2017. So there's a slight increase statewide, right? It's going up a little bit, but in orange shows the counties here in the North Country, and I focus on Clinton, Essex, Franklin, and St. Lawrence counties. We add all those up and look at the number. Now the scale is different, right? Because we don't have that many residents, and the numbers might be off because if you acquire Lyme disease here and you're a visitor, it's probably going to be reported in your county of residence. So it's probably an underestimate. But notice how it's rapidly rising. So, right? So it's going up, and I don't have the numbers yet for 2018 and 19. I'll have to get with Susan on that as soon as those become available. So yes, the number of cases of Lyme is rapidly rising. We broke it down by county, and no surprise, your county, Essex County, is in yellow here. This, I sort of converted it, sort of made it per capita. So the number of cases per 100,000 people, right? And notice that that is rapidly rising in Essex County, in Clinton, and starting to see the rise in the other North Country counties. I think Susan would probably agree with me, and I know she focuses, her work is in Essex County, but when we compare Essex with other counties, such as Dutchess County, the incidence per 100,000 people is one of the highest in the state here in Essex County. Sometimes we lose track of that because it's a sparsely populated county. But that's one thing that I think we need to raise awareness of. The risk per individual is very, very high here and seems to be on the rise. I don't have a slide to show it, but the incidence rate in the lower Hudson Valley and on Long Island is actually going down. So this kind of shows the change if you like looking at maps. So the darker red the area is, the more Lyme incidence there is. So this is in 1994, I believe, and now here, 1994 to 2016. So notice in 1994, there were a few cases reported in these counties, but it was localized really to the southern part of New York. Yay, Keith Collins made it. Yay! It's good, and we saved you some spaghetti from dinner. Keith's a trooper.
I never drove that fast in my life.
Uh-oh. You didn't encounter a trooper, did you? Oh, this is great. Okay, so then looking at 2016, notice how the red has spread northward and a little bit westward, but mainly northward. Look at Essex County. And now look at the decrease down here. Why is that? We don't know. My personal opinion is that, at least in part, the biology of the disease is changing. It's maybe not one disease, but many diseases. There are many strains of Lyme disease, and the new areas seem to have the most incidence of Lyme. So we have seen that, we talk about it. It's an interesting thing that we observe. We don't have an explanation, but yes, Essex County is as high incidence as this area that we often focus on as being the place where you get Lyme. So my job, I'll just talk a little bit briefly about what I do. I study host-seeking tick populations in the North Country, so I have a great job. I wanted to do field work, but I didn't know I'd be going to the most mosquito-ridden, tick-infested places wearing a white coverall, and I can't wear repellent, but I really do enjoy field work, and so that's what I do. So we study host-seeking ticks. And Keith will acknowledge this, I think. It's the piece of data that we think is the most critical for protecting human health. Where are the ticks? What diseases do they harbor? And Keith will back me up on this. To make decisions in the clinic, they have to have the data that we get. It isn't it's not rocket science, but it's critical. And what we have noticed, it's always been the case, is that National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, CDC don't fund routine monitoring and surveillance work. We're trying to change that a bit, and I'm so happy to be working with Keith because he's backing me up on that. No matter what happens, environmentally, human health is important and should be top on the list of priorities, and we're really trying to change that culture a little bit. So it's a simple thing we can get easily and efficiently, but currently I don't have the money to do it. So we've been working on this for 5 years. We go to various sites, around 40 if we can. In the North Country, we determine tick density and we do pathogen testing. And this is all done collaboratively with the New York State Department of Health in Albany, the vector ecology lab there. So we are very pleased to do it by the standard surveillance methods and collaboratively with them so that the data that we get is used on the New York State Department of Health website, so providers and all the counties can use it, but it's also communicated with the CDC. So we get a lot of bang for our buck. If I was just working as an individual person, a professor with students doing projects and didn't follow these standard surveillance techniques and didn't have the Department of Health to do the testing, they really couldn't use my data. So it's done with the right collaboration. So this is a map showing the North Country and the sites that we see and a rough estimate of the density. No surprise, along Lake Champlain in red are the highest density sites. Up here along the St. Lawrence, over in western St. Lawrence County, those are all lower elevation sites. It's a little bit warmer. That's where we see the highest density, but we're starting to see some surprises. Like this site, which is actually in Wilmington, right at the base of Whiteface Mountain, is one of our highest density sites now. We're also seeing them as high as 1,800 feet of elevation. Even I've had reports that aren't confirmed at around 2,400 feet in elevation. So they really are moving not only northward, but upward into the high peaks region. So we try to keep our communication consistent. That's really important. So our statement really is there is risk of acquiring tick-borne disease throughout the North Country of New York, the Adirondack region. The highest risk is still at lowest elevation, and tick densities are still patchy, but rapidly changing. So here's what we found last year. What we tried to do is collect at least 50 ticks from at least one site in each of the counties. Sometimes I visit 8 counties with my students, but I try to focus on the 4 that it's most difficult for the state Department of Health to reach. So last fall, we collected 500 ticks from 8 sites, and here were the results. So 64% were tested positive for Lyme. So people often ask me, if I get bitten by a tick, should I save it and test it? Keith can talk about this too. Probably assume that it's a coin toss. Assume that that tick is infected with Lyme. It doesn't mean you will get Lyme from that tick, but assume it's infected. And I would probably recommend, and my colleagues at the state level suggest, don't send the tick for testing. Those labs are really not certified, and there's not quality control there. So then it's not a diagnostic level test. It could be, and it's expensive. So it could be interesting, but you shouldn't, a physician probably shouldn't use that to make a diagnostic decision. But interestingly, what we've seen very recently is that these other diseases are rearing their ugly head here as well. Where the first few years of our study, we only saw Lyme. In the last 2 years, we're seeing quite a high incidence of Babesia microti. And I think Keith is going to talk about that a little bit. An average of 10% of ticks in this region have that, and anaplasma. And Keith will talk about that he's seen in Essex County last year. We also, you have to keep in mind, if you're bitten by a tick, that tick has a chance of being infected with multiple pathogens, not just Lyme, but Lyme and Babesia, Lyme and anaplasma, and sometimes all 3. And here in Essex County last year, we had quite a high percentage of ticks. I think it was around 5% of the ones we collected tested positive for all 3 pathogens. So that's important to know. It's important for physicians to know as well. Mm-hmm. 5. Right. So these are testing them individually, but if you look at each one, many of them were multiply infected. And that's an interesting phenomenon, that they seem to have a higher incidence of co-infection than you would expect by mere chance. So if a tick is infected with one, somehow it increases its chance of getting infected with some of the others. So babesiosis, oh, my slide moved a little bit on me there, but just introduce that. It's of significance because it would be treated very differently than Lyme disease because it's a malaria-like parasite. So I'll leave that to Keith to talk about. Interestingly, we found this pathogen for the first time along the Clinton-Essex County border up near Wickham Marsh in 2016. And that was a surprise because it hadn't been found in ticks further north than way at the lower tip of Lake Champlain. And it seemed to jump a long way. That's what makes me think that birds are carrying ticks from one site to distant sites. Deer don't travel that far. But by 2017, we found Babesia throughout the North Country. I think we found it at 5 sites. So it doesn't slowly move, it moves quickly. And that's another reason why I think we have to do surveillance every year. In 2015, we did not have Babesia here in the North Country. 2016, we had it at one site. 2017, we had it throughout the northern region. Last year, it seemed to kind of go away a little bit. So it ebbs and flows. Another reason, like I say, for keeping an eye on this. And talking to Keith, it was kind of funny. I was in the audience at a talk he gave, and he mentioned that he had seen some Babesia cases, and I have too. I have a student who was diagnosed with it recently. So what I see in the field, he is seeing in the clinic. And that makes me know that my work's important and relevant, that they seem to be jiving pretty closely. So Babesia is on the rise as well. And notice here, Essex County is now lit up as a site of Babesia. So last fall, I was asked to do a study. Many of you, do you remember about the Powassan Virus outbreak that happened in Saratoga County a few years ago? Anybody know about Powassan Virus? It's of concern because it's a virus and there's really no treatment. It's an encephalitis virus, and the outcome can be very severe. There've only ever been maybe 125 cases diagnosed ever in the United States. Maybe a handful appear every year, but there were 3 within a few weeks in Saratoga County, which is just south of here. So that made the Department of Health wonder, and what we attempted to do last fall, and we did, was to establish the northern edge of spread of Powassan. So it seems to be moving north like the other tick-borne diseases do. So our goal was to catch it before it moved into the North Country and to see just how far north it had spread. So what we did, because it is very rare, is we did collect ticks in the field, but we also used hunter-harvested deer blood samples. We worked with some deer processors. And if a deer probably gets bitten by thousands of ticks in its life. If any of one of those ticks has Powassan virus, that deer will make antibodies to Powassan. So they're very sensitive sentinels for the disease. So it's a really good way to know if Powassan is there. The results of that, actually, I'll suggest that you look at the pamphlet that I sent out. I don't have a slide of it, but it's in the books. The short story here is there was no northern edge of spread. We found, on average, about 40% of deer in the North Country showed signs of Powassan virus exposure. It doesn't mean we're at tremendous risk, as explained in the brochure, and you could read through that. It just means that the disease is present, and it needs to be watched. We did find a pocket of ticks that tested positive. Between 4 and 5% of those ticks tested positive for Powassan, not in Essex County, but in western St. Lawrence County, which was a bit of a surprise as well. So I've talked too long, but I coordinated it well to let Keith get here. I just want to acknowledge my collaborators. I have I work often with my son, Jacob Sporn. He's been working on this project for 5 years. He was a student at Paul Smith's and now is employed by the Adirondack Watershed Institute. Melissa Przinski and Brian Backinson at the New York State Department of Health, the Bureau of Communicable Diseases, are my collaborators there. Laura Kramer and Alan Dupuis are the ones who do the Powassan testing, so we work closely with them. And much of the work is done by students from Paul Smith's who have chosen to work on this project as part of their senior capstone, their senior project. And up until recently, for 2 years, I received funding from the New York State Senate Task Force on Lyme and other tick-borne diseases, and we're working hard to ensure that that funding might be reestablished. So with that note, I will turn it over to Susan, I think. She's going to say a couple words. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I think it's a great topic, and I'm very, very pleased to be with such good company. And I'm very glad I could make it here. Thank you. So I think this is really what says a lot before we go too much further. When I was in training at UVM in 1998 as an infectious disease fellow, I was told there's no tick-borne illnesses in this area. I was told not to even consider it, that it was a zebra, and I should be looking for horses. All I can tell you now is tick-borne illnesses here are now horses. They're no longer zebras. So what I would like to do is go through some of the things that are common in our area. Can you hear better? Yeah. Sorry. So what I'd like to do is go through some of the tick-borne infections that we see in this area due to the interest of time. There's certainly a multitude of other tick-borne illnesses in the United States, but these are the main ones that we see right now, at least in our area, carried by the same single tick, which is the Ixodes scapularis tick, which is the deer tick, which is also known as the black-legged tick. And if you can see, that tick has black legs. And the ones I really want to focus on are the 4 there. Powassan, which I think Leanne just mentioned, Lyme disease, which everyone I think is already aware of. Anaplasmosis is the one that I have seen exploding over the last 2 years. We've already had 2 cases in our hospital this year. And Babesia, which I have not seen homegrown yet, but I'm going to be on the lookout for it now that I know what Leanne has seen here in the local population of our ticks. Also, I want to let you guys know, I think some of you have already addressed this, ways you can protect yourself from getting a tick bite and what you should do if you find a tick on you or someone in your family. Let's see, I am not doing this right. There we go. Oh, sorry, I'm technology challenged. How do I advance it? Oh, point it. Okay, sorry. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So Powassan is a virus, which is different than the other infections we're going to talk about because the other infections are bacteria, which are orders of magnitude more complicated than viruses. But this virus in particular has, as Leanne mentioned, it causes basically an encephalitis, which is an infection in the brain. There probably, I don't know this for certain, but I suspect that there are a lot of subclinical cases as well. But the cases that have come to light have all caused a brain infection called encephalitis. And it can be fatal, and even people who survive it often will wind up with permanent brain damage from it. And I'm going to show you what it actually looks like on an MRI image. And it's carried by the same tick that carries Lyme disease. And as Leanne mentioned, a lot of times these ticks are co-infected. I don't know what our local tick population is as far as having Powassan. Yes, but it must be fairly low at this point, I hope. Maybe not. Okay, great. All right, let me see if I can get this. There we go. So, all right, so this is an MRI of a brain. And what you see here is, let me just move over here a second so I can show you. The stuff in white is basically swelling in the brain. So this stuff and this stuff is not normal. The little bit of swelling. So all of this is where the brain has been infected by this virus and it's causing swelling in this person's brain. And that obviously is not a good thing. And unfortunately, with Powassan, unlike the other infections we're going to talk about, there is no specific treatment for it. Okay, what? Did it again, sorry. Okay, because, yeah, you can't trust me to do this right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, that's okay.
Just give me a nod.
All right, and if I go too long, you tell me, okay?
We need you to be good at this.
So there are blood tests and there are tests you can do on people's spinal fluid to look for this virus. There's a special test we have to fill out if we want to look for this. We have to contact New York State to look for it. So far, luckily, I haven't found it, but I've been on the lookout for it. And just like, what's the virus I'm trying to think of? The one that's carried in birds. West Nile, thank you. There's no specific treatment for this one either. And so all you can do is give people supportive therapy, and by that I mean if they have seizures, you treat the seizures. If this is obviously they get headaches, you treat the pain. But there's no actual treatment for the virus. The virus runs its course in the brain, and either you survive it or you don't, and if you do survive it, you usually wind up with brain damage. So this is one that I really do fear, and I hope we don't see very much of it because there's not much we can do about it at this point. Thank you. So now here's the one everybody always hears about, which is Lyme. And yes, this is important, but this is by far and away not the only thing that we are now seeing in our area. So if any of you ever wondered what Lyme disease, what the bacteria looks like, it's called a spirochete. And as you might think, the name implies that it has spirals. And the reason it has spirals is it's motile. It sort of has corkscrew motility. That's why it looks like what it does. And it's distantly related to syphilis, which is also a spirochete. But there are a lot of differences. Just to throw it out to you, they're both spirochetes. Okay? Thank you. So these are the two main ticks that carry Lyme disease. Ixodes scapularis, which is on our side of the ocean, and Ixodes pacificus, which is on the west coast. And just before we leave this slide, Leanne could tell you better than I can, these guys are not just sitting there, they're waiting. They have you can explain it better than I can. Oh, good, okay. So they're not just sitting around doing nothing, they're waiting for their chance, okay? And this is probably way out of date at this point at 2014, because by the time these things get published, they're obsolete. And so we, obviously, like I said, in 1998, I was actually chastised for even considering Lyme in this area. And now it's a common thing. So we can move on with this one. So over 36,000 cases confirmed each year. There's probably more than that. I'm sorry, Sue, is it Sue? Yes. She made a very important point, which is in early stage Lyme disease, which we'll talk about, you're supposed to treat as a physician without testing. If you see this rash called an erythema migrans rash, which we will show you in a second, you don't even need to do the test. You treat. And so we see a lot of these cases are probably not diagnosed. Now there is overdiagnosis of Lyme disease as well, which I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about as well. But in early stage Lyme disease, you're supposed to, if you're a physician, you're supposed to treat first and not worry about the blood test. Unlike later stage Lyme disease, where blood tests are important. So okay, we can go ahead and move on. I'm sorry you have to do this for me. Thank you. So I don't know, Leanne, did you already show this? Okay, very good. So if you notice, there's a larva stage of these ticks which don't infect humans. And then there's a nymph stage, which is very aggressive, if I remember correctly. And then there's adult stage, which also can infect humans. But by the way, humans aren't exactly what they're looking for. We just happen to be out there. Okay? So I think this is kind of important for you guys to understand. It's a little bit technical, but I think it's important. There's what we call early localized Lyme disease, which basically gives you a rash, which I'm going to show you. And you can just get the rash at that stage, the early stage, with no other symptoms. It can be associated with symptoms which we call in the United States a flu-like illness, but in reality, I think of it more as a malaria-like illness. I know we don't have malaria here anymore, but we did at one time, by the way. That's why the CDC is in Atlanta, because they were actually charged to get rid of malaria in the United States. So we did have malaria here at one time, and a malaria-like illness is basically fever, chills, headache, muscle aches, nausea, just not feeling well. And I think that fits better than a flu-like illness, which I associate mostly with coughing. But having said that, early disease can just be a rash, or it can give you this other non-specific illness. Early disseminated, usually you are sick. It's usually not just a rash, usually there's something else, and oftentimes these people feel sick with fever and chills and nausea. And then late stage Lyme disease is the one that's probably the hardest for physicians to basically recognize. But what I really want to point out is the early disseminated and the late stage Lyme disease, the blood tests are important, and they're almost always positive. Unlike early localized disease, where you don't need a blood test to diagnose it. Okay? So, early localized disease, it can present anywhere from 3 to 30 days after you get a tick bite. 5 centimeters, by the way, is about 2.5 inches. And it's the most common thing is a rash without central clearing, but the classic thing physicians are taught is that you get a rash with this central clearing. So let's go ahead and show you that. So this is what we're all taught as physicians, which is, you can see it's kind of a bullseye looking rash. And that's the most characteristic of Lyme, but it is not the most common rash of Lyme. And physicians sometimes get hung up because they look just for this without realizing that it doesn't have to look like this. Let's go to the next one. This is what it looks like most of the time, which is just this area of redness on the skin. It doesn't have that central clearing that everybody's been taught as med students, but that's the most common way early stage Lyme disease presents. And again, you don't have to be sick with fever or chills, you can just have that. And the other thing that's I think is important is most people who come in with this rash will not recall a tick bite, because guess what? Ticks are really good at attaching, feeding, and dropping off without being noticed. That's part of their modus operandi. Okay? So whenever, by the way, whenever a physician or someone says, oh, it can't be Lyme because they didn't have a tick, that is absolutely not true. Because you will not, most people will not know they were bitten. This is a variant that I see sometimes myself, and it can be very confusing. Who's heard of MRSA in this audience? Anybody ever heard of MRSA? Excellent. It stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. That's a bacterial infection, and it often will cause either an abscess or an ulcer on the skin, and it can absolutely look just like this. This often gets diagnosed as MRSA when it turns out to be Lyme. Again, that's where the time of year is important. If you see this in February, it's probably going to be MRSA. If you see this now, you have to think about both. The other thing that this can sometimes mimic is, what was the other thing I was going to tell you? Oh yeah, a spider bite. Oftentimes I'll hear that, oh, this may be a spider bite, but guess what? In our area, again, global warming may change this, there really aren't any spiders in our area that are going to cause this. So it's either going to be MRSA, or if at the right time of year, you have to think about Lyme. Okay? Okay, so I just mentioned that it's seldom this bullseye rash we've all talked about, and roughly 30% of patients have no other symptoms except the rash. And at this point, you diagnose and treat based on the appearance of the rash. I think it's even confusing and sometimes harmful to try to do blood tests at this stage, because at that early stage where you just have that one isolated rash, most of the time, at least, well, not most of the time, but about half the time, the blood test will be negative. And I cannot tell you how many times I have had people who were started out on treatment for Lyme, the blood test came back and their doctors stopped the antibiotic because, oh, the blood test was negative. And that is absolutely not the way to approach this. In early stage Lyme disease, you treat, and if you treat appropriately, you may never develop a positive blood test for Lyme if you treat early enough. Okay, let's go on. I just have to throw this one out because this was a case that I saw 2 years ago now. Patient came in, fever, chills, headache, muscle aches. They were diagnosed with the flu, but they had a bad headache, and so somebody decided they wanted to do a spinal tap to make sure they didn't have meningitis. They went through our ER, saw a physician there. They went through an admitting hospital, what we call a hospitalist. I don't know if you guys are familiar with what that is now, but it's a doctor that's employed by the hospital to treat people that are admitted to the hospital. Went through 2 doctors. We got consulted to see this patient. I was going around that day. I didn't get to him until about 9 o'clock at night, at which point they had already gone down to interventional radiology to get a spinal tap. And when the interventional radiologist rolled them over to do their spinal tap, he found this on their lower back. Exactly. And so notice that it has black legs. That is it. And this person was definitely sick. And this person actually had something called anaplasma and probably also had Lyme. All right? So early disseminated Lyme disease as opposed to early Lyme disease, it's an important distinction. That's where it goes from your skin when you first get it, and then it can invade your bloodstream. And when it invades your bloodstream, you get early disseminated disease. And early disseminated disease means that it's gone to other places. It can go to other spots in your skin through your blood, so it gets in your blood and it seeds other places in your skin, or it can seed the heart, or it can seed the brain, or the covering around the brain called the meninges, or it can even seed the peripheral nerves, and that gives you something called Bell's palsy. And these people are usually sick, but not invariably. So, okay? That's what it looks like when it seeds your skin. So you start out with one of these things, and that's early Lyme. But if you see more than one of these, that tells you, almost without exception, that this has already gotten into the bloodstream and is now moving into the other places in the skin. So, by the way, syphilis can look just like this. Again, there's some similarity because they're both spirochetes. And I have to keep that in mind when I see people, because one of the things you got to think about is syphilis. Okay, so at that stage, this is the important distinction. If you think someone has early disseminated Lyme disease, your blood tests are almost universally positive. If you don't have a positive blood test, then you better be looking for something else causing that rash, because it's probably not Lyme. There are other infections that can cause rashes. They don't usually look like that. We'll talk about some of them. But one of the things that I really think about is syphilis and something called tinea corporis, which is a fungal infection of the skin. There's also something called mycosis fungoides, which is actually a skin type of lymphoma that can look like that. Okay? Unfortunately, you never know what these things are. You got to keep in your mind, by the way, that you could have it wrong and back up. So if I think something's Lyme and it's not working out for me, I need to back up and think about what else it could be. That's part of my job too, is just because I think it may be Lyme, I got to keep an open mind that I could have it wrong. Okay? That's kept me I found that to be very helpful in my entire career, is to always keep in my mind that I may not be right the first time I come up with something. I may need to back up and take another look. So this is late stage Lyme. This is, by the way, this is how Lyme was first found in Connecticut. It was a group of children who were all coming in with arthritis in usually one knee. It used to be called Nantucket knee. And that is because they were presenting with late stage Lyme. That's after you've gone through the first two stages and it's then seeded a joint or it's seeded the brain. That's where it likes to go, as opposed to meningitis, which is an infection around the brain. Encephalitis is an infection of the brain. But this is the most common sort of late stage, which is an arthritis. Okay. And so there's a lot of misinformation about how to diagnose Lyme disease, and there can be a lot of harm if we don't stick to what the CDC recommends. Again, there's some other tests out there that are coming out, but they're not yet ready for prime time, and until they are, I think as physicians we should stick to this algorithm, which is made by the CDC, who knows better than I do. And basically you do a blood test first, what they call a screening blood test, to look to see if the person's immune system has made an antibody, which is a protein, against Lyme. And that protein, called an antibody, is unique and will only interact with the Lyme. It's specific for Lyme. If that's positive, then you go to the second step, which is to look for even a more specific group of antibodies called a Western blot. It's called a two-tier step. And again, this is good for early disseminated Lyme and for late stage Lyme. That's where this test is positive. If you have that just one isolated rash, you don't need this. Everybody get that? Okay, let's move on. There are a boatload of tests out there put out by labs that are not validated that claim that people have chronic Lyme and they need to be treated for years. And a lot of these tests are basically worthless. And they can cause harm if you follow them. And this is from the CDC specifically recommending not to do these tests. Okay? And I'm going to show you some harm that can occur if you overtreat Lyme. So again, if you have early disseminated or late stage, your normal blood tests that the CDC recommends are almost always positive. Okay? The other thing that has come up is that what we used to call chronic Lyme disease has been usurped and given a bad name. So now we just call it late stage Lyme disease. Chronic Lyme disease is not something that is not curable. Late stage Lyme disease is what it really is, and that is totally curable. Even if you have the knee infection, even if you have the brain infection, if you treat it with antibiotics, you can cure it. Lyme disease is not supernatural. It's a bacteria that can be killed by antibiotics. Okay, let's go on. So for 20 years, there's a whole group of alternative practitioners out there that claim that they are the only ones that can treat Lyme disease, that they're Lyme, quote, literate, and the rest of us, by, I guess, definition, are illiterate. I disagree with that. I think that they cause more harm than good. And I'm going to show you some of the harm that can cause if you treat people for Lyme disease for 2 or 3 years going on. All right, we can move on. One thing I wanted to do is say, okay, it's not just the United States. This is the Canadian statement on chronic Lyme disease, also known as post-Lyme disease syndrome. And basically what it's saying is that you can basically have had some damage because of the infection, but that doesn't mean you still have an active bacterial infection that needs to be treated. What you may be looking at is the damage that's been done, and that if it's the damage that's been done, giving people more antibiotics is going to cause more harm than good because there's nothing left to kill with the antibiotic, okay? This is incredibly important because I see just as many people hurt every year by overtreatment as I see people that actually have the infection that are treated. So again, this thing is not a supernatural being. You can kill it with antibiotics, all right? And again, this is a statement by the National Institute of Health on chronic Lyme disease. Again, there's no evidence that whatever the symptoms are, if it's fatigue, if it's what people call trouble concentrating, or I hear brain fog sometimes, there's no evidence that they have an ongoing active infection. What you're probably dealing with is residual damage that's been done. Just like when somebody has meningitis, unfortunately, a lot of times they don't get back to where they were before. And two wrongs don't make a right. Adding more antibiotics to treat something that's not an infection causes harm. This is a list of articles and there's a lot more. These are just the ones I chose to include about cases of people who were treated for Lyme disease, even sometimes with negative tests, that caused harm. There are a couple of those studies here that also talk to people about people that died because of complications from the antibiotics they were given when they didn't even have Lyme disease. So treatment of Lyme disease, overtreatment is not a benign thing. It can cause real harm.